Would you tell the people about a time when a street mime invaded the church and caused a whole ruckus?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was back, man, it would have to be in the early 2000s, I think. I was a youth pastor in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So yeah, it would have been late 90s to early 2000s. And we had a very interesting incident happen in the church service. Um, and when you say the street mime came in, he didn't come in dressed as a
Mm,
mime.
right.
So he was a little bit incognito as far as he probably would have been stopped by the ushers immediately had he had on white face paint and, actually dressed as a mime. But
Right.
we were having Sunday night service. And now, for those who are from maybe a Pentecostal background would understand when we say Sunday night church, it was very vibrant, very live. It was a lot of great music, loud music,
Right.
very exuberant worship, and he comes into that setting. We were doing a song that we love to do that would play out that it would work perfectly into his whole miming scenario that he had
Right.
ready for us that we didn't know. But anyways, he walks in the service and he looked like a fairly normal, fellow as far as just had on a fedora hat that was a little
Mhm.
unusual, carrying a quick trip cappuccino cup. That was a little unusual for that setting. We were a lot more formal in our services, and so someone coming in with a coffee cup was a little bit
Right.
out of character. Although these days I know it's a lot more acceptable. But so he came in with the coffee cup, got past the ushers, and he made his way down the center aisle of the church. I personally was playing the bass for the choir on that song, and the song, which was a fantastic, fun song to play, was called "Baptize Me, Jesus."
Baptize me,
Well,
Jesus.
as you can tell, that just kind of lends itself to the whole miming
Right.
miming incident. So he put his coffee cup down and began to kind of bob along with the music. We're like, oh, that's cool. He's on the front row. He wasn't bashful. He's coming right to the front.
Uh-huh.
And so as we start singing "Baptize Me, Jesus," he begins his antics. And so he's baptizing people, every time we would say it. And then Peter got up and started preaching, the verse said. So he went to waving his finger in the air. He was and this carried on, and so we're trying to kind of not pay that much attention to him because people are worshiping and really into the service. And then one young man from the choir takes off and he does a lap around the church. Again, if you're not from a Pentecostal background, that might sound
It's
crazy, but
wild.
it was all acceptable. So he's running around the aisles, and the mime starts pointing at him and follows him as he
Yeah.
goes around. And when he gets to the front, the mime says, "Safe."
Safe.
And when he did, that was when I could no longer keep my composure.
Yeah.
So now laughing very visibly up there, and everyone in the choir, a lot of them are trying to keep from just busting out laughing because the guy continues just getting funnier and funnier. Well, the pastor, who was a very forceful personality, he kind of just let it ride. He was like, "Hey,
Right.
don't make it a bigger deal." And so we finally shut down the song, and he goes to preach. The Pastor Howard, and so he started to preach. The mime began to assist him as well, and so he starts miming everything he's saying, but also now he found his voice. So he's being verbal, and
Right.
he's just adding to everything that's being said, finishing verses when he would try to quote them. And it's becoming pretty distracting. So Pastor Howard had finally had enough of it. And so he steps over towards him and he says, "Young man, we're glad that you're here, but we're going to need you to quieten down."
Right.
And the young man said, "I can say what I want to. This is my father's house."
Right.
And Pastor Howard said, "Well, I don't know whose house you think you're in, but if you keep interrupting the service, we're going to have to ask you to leave." "I will not leave. This is my father's house. You cannot throw me out of my father's house," he says. And so he just tried to keep on preaching. Then the guy speaks up. He says, "My name is Figgy." He said, "My name is Figgy Figaro,
Piggy Figaro.
Figgy Figaro, and this is my father's house, and you cannot tell me to be quiet in my father's house." And so finally, Pastor Howard says, "Look, we're going to ask you to leave this service." "I will not leave this service. This is my father. You leave this service," he tells him. And so the ushers by this point are converging, and they come in
Mhm.
on this guy, and they grab him and literally physically had to pick him up and usher him down the
Right.
aisle. They take him out the front door, and so Pastor Howard says, "Hey, everybody, let's pray and continue moving on with this service." Well, we did, and he continued preaching, uh, and he continued preaching, and our ushers had not come back in.
Right.
He went on about 5 minutes, about 10 minutes. Finally, he stepped over to me. I was sitting on the platform, and he said, "You probably want to step outside and see what's going on out
Right.
there." And so I step out the door, and we had some of the most, I mean, just energetic and well-intentioned but feisty little guys
Right.
on the usher team. And he's still out there talking about their pastor, and calling him names and all this. And one of them had him by the shirt like this, and had his hand back and was fixing to plow this dude. And I called his name. I said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 stop, stop. We can't do that." And he said, "He's talking about my pastor." And boy, he's just fixing to tear him up. And I said, "Well, hitting him ain't going to solve anything."
Right.
And so I backed him off, and I said, "Hey, Figgy, was that your name?" "Yes, sir. I'm Figgy Figaro." And I said, "Well, Figgy, look, man, thanks for coming out tonight, but you've been asked to leave because it was kind of a distraction to our service, and so it'd be better if you just go ahead and leave." I said, "Man, I could call the police and we could have them, remove you, but we don't want to do that.
Right.
Just go ahead and make this easier." I talked him down finally, and so he said, "All right." He said, "You just tell that man in there all I was trying to do was help him." And I said, "I'll tell him that, Figgy." And he said, "All right." He said, "Well, I'm going to leave." I said, "Well, that's probably a good idea." He's heading to his car. He turned around. He said, "But I'll be back." And I said, "Okay." He said, "And next time I'm bringing 50 Jezebels with me." And I said, "Well, hey, man, I hope you'll come back and behave sometime. But if you bring 50 Jezebels, I
Right.
reckon we'll call the whole police department out here to
Right.
escort all y'all out of here."
Get
And
all of them.
so, yeah, Figgy went on. Now, another little cool thing about that was just kind of a funny, very disruptive thing that happened in
Mhm.
one of our services. But not long after that, as a youth pastor, I was driving the church van,
Mhm.
and I had a van full of screaming young people. And somebody saw a car. And by the way, back up, Pastor Howard and I the next day actually looked up in the phone book to see if there really was a Figgy Figaro. That looked up in the phone book. That
Right.
tells you how long ago this happened. And there was indeed in the phone book was
Right.
a Figgy Figaro. But we're driving on a youth event, and one of the young people holler out, and they say, "Brother Pixler." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Look at that car. It's Figgy." And we looked over, and there's this old brown, like Buick Classic kind of, or no, maybe it was a Caprice, whatever. It's an old car, and in letters like you would put on your mailbox, across the back was spelled Figgy
Piggy Figaro.
Figaro.
That's
And so
great.
we're all waving, and the kids are having a good time. And then the last I ever heard of Figgy was in the Tulsa World. There was a news story about him, and he had been arrested at Grace Bible
Yeah.
Fellowship for miming in their service. And in the story, he said to the reporter, "I reckon I'll just stick to bars because they don't seem to appreciate my gift of miming in the churches."
Right. Well,